Good afternoon, beloved family, brothers and sisters. Good afternoon. I hope that by the grace of God we have so far been having a blessed week. Last night in prayer meeting, as I said today to those who were there, I hope you had a great week, but remember that in this world, it is for our benefit that we sometimes go through difficulties and trials. So when you think of having a great week, remember that that includes also the negatives, the things that seem to be bad, challenging, make life hard for us, because it is through these difficulties that God is able to strengthen us and make us into the kind of people that we should be. So anyway, glad to be with you again this evening, and I appreciate all the wishes, the greetings, the blessings back to you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and begin with prayer, so I invite you to bow your heads with me. Dear Father, I am truly appreciative for the blessings we have enjoyed at your hand today. I can speak for myself that I have been blessed. And I want to thank you and to tell you that I appreciate everything. Now as we come together again to study your word, I pray that you will infuse or fill our hearts with your spirit. Fill our thoughts with good thoughts of you, that we may be truly appreciative of the kind of person that you are, and of the privilege we have to worship the wonderful God of heaven. We commit ourselves into your hand now, Father, and pray that you will bless us as we study your word together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, well, we have been... All right, so Wayne is asking if I am sounding low. Let me just take a second and see if there is something not so good that I can correct. I don't know, for some reason my audio settings sometimes just go down by themselves, and I think I am low here. Yeah, I'm very low. Alright, I should be better now. Wayne, I have no idea. I have a feeling that my GoToMeeting platform sometimes adjusts the settings, and that is probably what is happening. But I should be okay now. Alright, so might even be a little bit high now. Alright, we have been, of course, going through the book of John, and we completed chapter 17 last week. We're on the last lap. From here on, we are going to be looking at the last moments of Jesus' life. So this is where we look at his crucifixion, resurrection, and the things that happened afterwards. As we look at chapter 18 here this evening, one of the things that will come home to us is the reality that John's writings are much different from the other writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm going to show you one of the outstanding differences right here as we start this evening. Alright, we have John chapter 18 on the left, and in the right panel we will have Matthew 26. Alright, so John 18 says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kedron, where was a garden, into the which he entered and his disciples." So it says, "And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oft times resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? But you will recognize that there is a lot that happened that is left out here in the book of John. In Matthew it says, Then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and saith unto the disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder. In John it simply says there was a garden, but here Matthew tells us that the name of the place was Gethsemane. So Jesus tells them to sit here while I go and pray, and he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. I'm not sure why John left out all of this, but he says nothing about it. But I suspect it's because John wants to focus on certain teachings of Christ and certain lessons to be learned from the experience of Christ. He's not focusing on certain details. And if you look at his book, you will pick this up very clearly. In the book of John, we have more of the teachings of Christ, the deep teachings, the mysterious sayings. They are here in the book of John. Many of the details that you will find in the other books are not here, And even the places where you see miracles like healing somebody, it's always told with the lesson behind it. Why did Jesus heal this man on the Sabbath? He wanted to make a point. So I think that's the reason why John leaves out some of these details, but it's still interesting, and we will just take a look at it here in Matthew as we are at that portion of the book of John. So Jesus tells them, My soul is sorrowful even to death. He asks them to watch with him, and he goes a little further, falls on his face, and he says, If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. I think that's such an important thing. But it's not a part of what John wants to say, and so he leaves it out. He comes and finds them sleeping again, and he says to Peter, What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? And I think it's significant that he says unto Peter. The three of them are sleeping, but he's talking to Peter. And why does he single out Peter? It's because Peter is the one who said, If everybody will forsake you tonight, I won't. It was Peter who was the one who was boastful and always talking and putting himself up front. So he's trying to make Peter understand his need. And so he's a little sarcastic. He says, What? Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? And then he told him that he should watch and pray that he would not enter into temptation. So he's giving him an idea that something terrible is about to happen, and Peter needs to be prepared through prayer. And then he went away again the second time, and it says he comes back and he finds them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. I can understand and kind of sympathize with the disciples. There are sometimes when sleep really comes upon you and nothing you can do. Well, at least for me, I know when I really want to sleep, I have to find a place and even get 5 minutes. If I can shut my eyes for 5 minutes, if I can just get my brain to go click, then I'll be okay. But it looks like they're really sleeping. They're going to have heavy sleep each time he moves away. He goes and he prays the third time. And now he comes back. He says, Sleep on now and take your rest. And again, I think he's been a little sarcastic, because now is the time of trouble. Now is the time when they need to be awake. But I guess what he's saying is, you weren't able to stay awake when you should. So what's the point of being awake now? And then it tells you that while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves. And it tells you of the terrible deed that Judas did. Forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. Then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And it goes on to give you the details that Peter, it says one of them, but it was Peter, drew his sword, struck a servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Jesus told him, put up your sword. All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. And he tells them he could have prayed to the Father and he would give him 1,200 angels. So there was no need to fight because God had it all covered. But John gives you some little details. All right, it says that Jesus says, who are you looking for? It doesn't tell you about Judas or about Peter cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. It just tells you, they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. So, for John, this is one of the high points of what happened in the garden. It's interesting that none of the other gospel writers mentions this little detail that Jesus said, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And then he said, I am he. I suppose this is after Judas kissed him. And when he said, I am he, everybody fell backwards. So, I think John is making this point because he, in his book, he's emphasizing over and over the divinity of Jesus. He is very careful, very forceful in making the point that Jesus is the Son of God. And so I think, all the other details about Peter cutting off the man's ear, about Judas kissing him, all of this is kind of irrelevant to the main point that John wants to make, which is that the person who was here was a divine being. You notice how his book starts out. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God, or the Word was a divine being. So that is his point, and that is why I think he does not give us all those details that you see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But he tells us more about the divine event. Jesus says, I am he, and everybody falls down. He's showing them that there is a power present with him that was not normal. And he, of course, he could have stepped away. He could have escaped from them at any moment because he had this power. But the point is that he chose to go to his crucifixion. He submitted himself to them because if he had not done it, nobody could have killed him. He could not have taken our place in coming under the power of Satan and of sin. He had to subject himself to it, and so he voluntarily went to it. All right? Probably one of the most tragic things that we can see here in verse 3. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Only God knows what was going on in the mind of Judas. I don't think, he might have been just a straight devil. I have known people who betray people just out of perversity. They just have such an evil spirit, such an evil heart, that it is a delight to them to betray somebody else. But I really don't think this was exactly the way it was with Judas, because you remember that afterwards Judas come back and said, I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. So I don't think it was pure wickedness why Judas betrayed Jesus. He had some kind of motive. I have had friends who no longer were my friends, or who were not as close to me as they were before. We might have had some conflict, some disagreements, but I don't know of any of them who turned around to hate me so much that they would turn traitors and betray me for me to be killed. So the question is in my mind sometimes, why would Judas do something like this? And I tend to accept what one writer says. One writer says that he was expecting, he was believing that Jesus would have saved himself. And why would he do this? If you remember, Judas was one of them who, he was one of those who apparently he thought he was smarter than Jesus. You know, Peter kind of had that idea too, but not as strong as Judas. Judas was a well-educated person. I forget what was his original profession, but anyway, he joined up with Jesus and his disciples to see what benefit he could gain. And he believed that Jesus was going to be the Messiah. He believed that much. But he believed that Jesus was moving too slowly. Jesus was not approaching the thing the right way. He wanted to be Jesus' counselor and right-hand man. And so he felt he could accomplish the job better than Jesus or quicker than Jesus. He saw the power that was with Jesus, and he understood that Jesus could overthrow an army if he chose. He saw him raise the dead, heal the sick, and he was thinking, what could this man do on a battlefield? So what he decided to do was to force Jesus' hand, to put him in a place where they came to kill him, where they came to take him prisoner, and then Jesus would deliver himself, and Jesus would set up himself as king, overthrow his enemies. And of course, in the process, Judas could gain 30 pieces of silver, gain a little extra money on the side. Because if you look at what it says that he took a band of men, a band of soldiers, and he went and he took them to betray his master. Why would you take a band of enemies? Why would you take enemy soldiers with weapons to your master, to somebody that you have been walking with for probably 3 years? Why would you do this? And so I lean to the interpretation that Jesus, he believed that he could use his smarts and get Jesus to force his hand, and to by making him prisoner of these people, he would force Jesus to show his power, and they would be compelled to subject themselves to him, to submit to him. So was Judas really such an evil person? You know, Jesus calls him the son of perdition. And the only other person in the Bible who is called the son of perdition is the Antichrist, the man of sin. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Antichrist is referred to as the man of the son of perdition. And so was Judas. It's almost like, the Bible is saying these men were destined for damnation. And it's not that God chooses that destiny for anybody, but it's that God sees the future and he understands the way the lives of these men will develop. And so they were sons of perdition. They were people who took a course that led to their inevitable destruction. So, but what was the great evil in Judas's life then? And when we consider this, we come to a sobering conclusion. Judas's great evil was not that he was an Adolf Hitler. It was not that he was a Nero. These are men who have been responsible for the death of millions. And some of them in the most brutal and cruel way. He was not one of these mass murderers that cut up people and put their bodies in bags, or abused women and murdered hundreds of them. No, he wasn't one of these embodiments of wickedness as we tend to define wickedness today. So what was so terrible about his crime? This is what I say is a sobering realization. Judas's great crime was that he thought he was smarter than the Son of God. If you think about it, yes, he was greedy. Yes, he was selfish. Yes, he was ambitious and self-seeking. These are attributes that you could say almost every human being possesses. You could say even among many of us who are Christians, we still struggle with some of these things. So these were not the main the main evil that was found in Judas. The real evil was that he stood face to face with the Son of God. He stood face to face with divinity and still thought he was smarter. Now, I agree that Peter also was guilty of the same thing, but Peter's guilt was a little different, because every time Jesus rebuked him, he saw himself and he backed down. He never set himself to stand up against the wisdom of Christ. He was just foolish at times. When Jesus said, you're going to deny me tonight, he said, Lord, I will never do that. He wasn't really defying Christ. He was just being foolish, childish, you might call it, thinking that, no, that can't be, not me. But Judas, that night at the table, when Jesus gave him his last chance, when Jesus says, the one who dips his bread with me will betray me, staring him in his face, Judas knew that Jesus understood what he was about to do. And the Bible says, when Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. He went out, and it was night. He went out to betray Christ, knowing that Jesus knew what he was going to do. Knowing that he was dealing with the Son of God, somebody that he believed to be the Messiah, because he thought he could deliver himself. He knew he was the Messiah. He went out to betray him because he thought to the face of God, he thought he was smarter than God. And the only person who ever did this before was Satan. Satan is the one who stood up to God face to face and declared himself to be smarter and wiser than God. So maybe that is the reason why Judas is called the son of perdition. And maybe that is the reason why the Antichrist is called the son of perdition too. Maybe it is in the light of the glory of God that he stands up and declares himself to be God in the place of God. But that's another story. But anyway, I think that's probably the reason why the Bible describes him as the son of perdition, because it takes a lot of barefacedness to stand up in the very presence of divinity, knowing that this is the Son of God, and to declare yourself wiser, to think yourself wiser than he. My goodness, when I think of it now, I mean, this thought has occurs to me for the first time this evening, and when I think of it, it's really a striking thought. It's a thought that, it makes me stop and think. All of us from time to time, we put dependence upon our own confidence. But I mean, man, to stand in the presence of divinity, knowing that this is the Son of God, and you set yourself to be smarter than him. Yeah, that has to be a kind of conceit and self-centeredness that is only equaled by Lucifer's rebellion against God. So, okay, I see why the Bible refers to him as the son of perdition. But anyway, so Jesus, it says, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, whom seek ye? And just before I go any further, I appreciate the verse that Brother Wayne highlighted. It ties into what I was saying a little earlier on. It's in John chapter 21, last chapter of John, where John says, it might be chapter 20. John, Wayne put the text there, but I just looked and saw it. I didn't look at the text, but let's see. It's in chapter 20, I think. Yeah, it's the last verse of chapter 20, where John tells you clearly the purpose for which he has written this book. These things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That is his statement of purpose. He wrote these things. He recorded the things in this book specifically so that people might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And I highlight this because that's what I was trying to say earlier on, that John in his book is not concerned about some details. He's not telling a story, an interesting story. He's telling a story with a focus. Everything that I put in this story, I want you to look and to see divinity. I want you to see the hallmark of God. And so that's why he doesn't tell you many details, and he gives details that the others do not talk about, because they probably had a different goal in mind in writing their books. But his goal was the divinity of Christ. And so, yes, thank you for that reminder of that verse, Brother Wayne, because indeed, that explains why even this little detail about Jesus saying, I am he, and they fell backwards. That's why John puts it in, because that's a mark of divine power in this person. That's verse 6. As soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. So he displays his divine power. They fall back on the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And so now he submits himself to them. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. Okay, then it goes on to tell about Peter chopping off the man's ear. I didn't realize it was here in John, but yeah. All right, so that detail is there. But it's there also because it gives an opportunity for John to show, again, the power of Christ. All right, but anyway, verse 9 first of all. So Jesus says, let these go their way. And John understands that at this moment, Jesus is still speaking up for his disciples. He's saying, you have come for me? Here I am. I told you that I am he. So let these disciples go their way. I suppose they didn't come for the disciples. But it's possible that they might have just scraped up everybody, taken everybody. Because the idea would be to, now that we want to put an end to this this false movement, let's just put a stop to it. Let's at least capture everybody and scare them out of their wits, even if we're going to crucify the ringleader. But Jesus says, I have told you that I am he. You have me now. You don't need to bother these. Let them go their way. We are told that everybody forsook him and ran away, but apparently they didn't try to stop them. But John says this was so that the saying might be fulfilled, something Jesus said a little earlier on in the previous chapter. Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. So, John is applying it here in the sense of physical safety. But I still believe that when Jesus said this, he meant that, those that you have given me. If you go back to John 17, you remember Jesus says, it was 17 or 16, of those whom you have given me, I have lost none, except the son of perdition. So Jesus said that he had lost Judas, and he did not mean I lost him, meaning that he had died. He means I lost him in the sense that he never stayed with me. He went over to the devil's side. That's what it meant when it says, I have lost none, except the son of perdition. So I think Jesus is primarily saying, these who have become my disciples, I have kept them, and they have become a part of my movement. They will become a part of my kingdom. I didn't lose one of them. None of them fell back. None of them apostatized. None of them went back into darkness except the son of perdition. But of course, John is here applying it in a secondary way also to the physical safety of the disciples. He's saying that this is also one meaning that Jesus is saying, none of them, I didn't lose any of them to death or to prison. But this cannot be the primary meaning of Jesus, because remember, shortly afterwards, Stephen was stoned to death, and James was put in prison, and Herod beheaded him, cut off his head. So if Jesus meant to say None of them has died. When he says, I have lost none, then it would mean he lost Stephen and he lost James later on. So this is not his main meaning, even though John applies it this way. But he's talking about losing them by them going back to the old way. But now it goes on to tell you about Peter's misguided zeal. You know, I've heard it said, and I've said it myself, and I know it is true. It is easier to die for Jesus than to live for Jesus. It's easier to die for Jesus than to live for Jesus. And you can see, because Peter pulls his sword, and I tell you something, if 5 men had come to attack him, he would have fought them, even to death. He would have given his life that evening. And it shows you that sometimes as Christians, we don't understand what is required. The thing that is most required is what we don't give. You know, we are spontaneous. We are, like so many humans, we are combustible. We move for the moment and for the event. It's easy to be strong for 30 seconds, for 1 minute, for 5 minutes. But when that strength means that we must continue for a day, for 2 days, for an extended period, and things become difficult, it becomes much harder. And you know, it's kind of like fasting. I've fasted many times for 1 day. On 2 occasions I've fasted for 3 days. One time I set out to fast for 21 days. Look here, after day number 3, I couldn't take it any longer, and I gave up. It reminds me of this principle of standing for the Lord. Peter was ready for something that took a moment, but when it became more challenging, when he had to endure without lashing out and fighting physically, he lost it. He lost his way, he lost his strength, and he turned around and betrayed the Lord. So Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And again, John gives us some details here. He's the one who tells us the name of this person, and he tells us which ear. And I always say, do you realize that Peter was aiming for the man's neck? Peter was aiming for the neck. Nobody is that accurate with a sword that you can chop off a man's ear. Plus, you know, in those days, the swords were heavy. They were not delicate instruments like, you know, you see that they can make today. It was a heavy instrument. The reason why the man's ear got cut off is because he moved his head just in time. And instead of, he swung his head to one side, probably swung his body, and so it caught the ear and missed the neck. Peter was heading to kill that man that night. And you have to say it was the grace of God why he never did, because if he had murdered that guy, then certainly Peter would have ended up beheaded or even crucified with Jesus. But the man moved his head, I believe, and so Peter missed and cut off his right ear. Now I am sure that everybody, all the soldiers and the men that were there, this great multitude, I'm sure they pulled out their weapons and they were ready to attack Peter, except that Jesus stood right in the middle. He spoke up. He spoke up quickly. He said, "Put up your sword," before anybody could react. Immediately he said, "Put up your sword into its sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me to drink, shall I not drink it?" And then we are not told here in John, but he reached out his hand, touched the man's ear, and healed it. Performed a miracle right there, which certainly caused the multitude to think. They didn't raise their hand having seen the miracle. And secondly, Jesus told Peter, those who take the sword will perish with the sword. Those who use the sword will perish with the sword. Those words struck home even to this band of soldiers and careless people. And I think that's the reason why they did not fall upon Peter and kill him immediately. Because he had attacked one of them and drawn blood, and clearly he was out for blood, and they would have killed him. But Jesus stepped right in the middle and put a stop to it, as I said. It says, he appeals to Peter in two ways. He says, first of all, if you take the sword, you will die with the sword. And the cup that my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? He's bringing back to Peter's memory all the things he had said about going to die, even though Peter is not getting it. But then he says, don't you think I could ask my Father for 12 legions of angels? And he would immediately give me. And so he's really making Peter know that I am here, not because they are taking me. I'm here because I choose to be here. I choose to drink this cup. And I could say the message is not just for Peter. It's for everybody who is there. It's for these soldiers. It's for these captains. It's for these elders, whoever is there. He wants them to know that it is his will. It is his purpose. They are taking him because he chooses to go with them. He doesn't want his servants to fight. He's going with them. And I suppose anybody there who has a little bit of consideration would wonder, this is something I need to think about. It says, then the band and the captain, all of those were there. The band of soldiers, the captain, the officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. And again, it shows you it reminds me of some of these policemen that you see sometimes. You really wonder at the way people behave when they have a little power. Because it says that they took him and they tied him up. Why do you need to tie up somebody when it is clear that the person is not resisting? When you have heard him say, my Father has given me this cup to drink and I'm drinking it. When you have seen him heal one of your own number, why do they bother to tie him up? It reminds me of what I see of many of these policemen. Somebody, they tell him, get on the ground. He gets on the ground. They go and kneel on the person. The person is cooperating. And then they, for some trivial reason, they put handcuffs on the person. When the person is cooperating with them fully, has no desire, no intention to resist, but they have to pin him down and restrain him from moving and put him in an uncomfortable position. It's kind of the attitude of people when they have a little power, because it is clear that Jesus does not need to be tied. But I think they want to bring him to the high priest so that the high priest can see how zealous they are for their job. Just drinking a little coconut water here, hoping it will will be good for my voice. My voice is a little gravelly, as you can probably hear. Anyway, it says they led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. So, Caiaphas was the high priest. Annas was his father-in-law, which means that Caiaphas was married to Annas' daughter. Now, I'm not sure exactly how they had modified the priestly system in that day. I know that in the days of Moses and for hundreds of years, the only person who could be high priest would be the son of the previous high priest. So I'm not sure if this was the same situation that prevailed at that time. But anyway, they led him to Annas. And I suppose what we can gather from this was that although Caiaphas was the high priest, Annas carried a great deal of power. You could suggest that he was also the one who was the controlling force behind Caiaphas. So this band of soldiers clearly was not Roman soldiers. It was Jewish soldiers. They They came with a captain, and they were officers of the Jews, and they carried him away to Annas first, for he was a father-in-law of Caiaphas. Now, it says, now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. I think we remember that, where Caiaphas said, you know nothing at all, nor consider it is good for one man to die, that the people perish not. Caiaphas meant we better kill him before the Romans come and destroy all of us, because he's creating sedition against the Romans. So Caiaphas meant we should kill him to save the nation from being destroyed by the Jews. But John says he was the high priest, and he was prophesying that year, even though he did not know what he was saying. But John is saying that behind the words of Caiaphas, there was a deeper meaning, that Jesus would die for the sins of the Jews. He would give his life for the Jews, and not for them only, but for the whole world. So he was saying that even in this careless, arrogant, wicked statement, God was actually using Caiaphas to prophesy. Now, I just want to stop and make a little point, to focus on that point for a little bit, because this explains how the Bible writers sometimes looked at biblical prophecy and biblical statements. You could look at this and you could say, that's not what Caiaphas meant at all. Caiaphas was not prophesying, because Caiaphas was actually talking about murdering Jesus so the Romans would not destroy the Jews. And but John takes the statement. He doesn't look at the meaning that Caiaphas wanted to give, and he takes a statement and he gives it a different meaning. It's kind of like where he says, a little earlier up, I saw, what was the statement I was commenting on again? Yeah, it's this statement where John takes the words of Jesus. He says that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. As I was pointing out, I think that Jesus' original meaning was that none of them apostatized or went back to the way of the world or anything. But John gives us a second meaning, and he applies it in a second way. And I'm just making the point that you can look many places in the writings of the apostles, the gospel writers, and you see them doing the same thing. They will take a statement from the Old Testament, from the writings of Isaiah or some other prophet, and when you go and look at the original statement, it does not seem to be saying this at all. But they see a different meaning, because they believe that when somebody spoke these words or wrote these words, God had a deeper meaning, or God had a secondary meaning to what was being said. So, you know, for example, in the book of Isaiah, where it says that, behold, a virgin shall conceive, and shall bring forth a son, and before he's old enough to know good from evil, the land shall be forsaken of both her kings. If you look at the context of that statement, it was talking about, I think it was Isaiah's wife who was to have a child. And God said the child would eat butter and honey. And before the child was old enough to know good and evil, the two enemies of Judah, the king of Syria, I believe, and the king of Samaria, they will be taken away. But Matthew takes the same statement and he applies it to Jesus when he says, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son. So, if you look at the context in the original, you will say that's not what it means at all. And that's what Bible critics will do, because there are many statements like this in the Bible. But what a Bible critic cannot do is express a spirit-directed opinion. In other words, many of the things that God says in the Bible have more than one application. But a normal person cannot see that application, because all that we can do is look at context. But somebody led by the Spirit, somebody directed by the Spirit of God, can see a deeper intent, a second intent behind what God recorded, because it is still the Word of God. And so they will give this deeper meaning. And we see this happening here when Caiaphas says it was expedient that one man should die for the people. He meant one thing. But John says that God had a deeper meaning behind it. God was speaking through this man, even though he was an agent of Satan. But because he was sitting in the seat of the high priest, God used him to say a word that was really true. All right, now it's interesting that although Peter has chopped off the man's ear, almost ended his life, you have to give Peter some credit. Because, I mean, most people would have made themselves so scarce you wouldn't see them again. But you can tell that Peter really loved Jesus. And that's the thing. You know, when you love somebody, then, you know, when they are in danger, you go with them. It says, and Simon Peter followed Jesus. I suppose he was the last man that those soldiers wanted to see. Maybe if they had seen him following, they would have taken hold of him and locked him up, because they knew his intent. They knew he had a sword, and they knew that he had used that sword. I would have been very careful if I was one of them and seen Peter following. So it says Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, and this other disciple was John. Later on we see that it's John. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and he went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. And that's an interesting thing, because I beg your pardon. That's an interesting thing, because apparently John was known to the high priest well enough that when he went there and said, I am John, they would let him in. They wouldn't have any question about him going there. So clearly, John went there sometimes. So I don't know what kind of business John had. Maybe, he was a fisherman. Maybe he went there selling fish. Maybe that's the most likely thing. He and James were fishermen, so probably the high priest was one of his clients. Anyway, he was known. He went there, and they let him in. They knew he was a harmless fellow, even though they probably recognized that he was one of Jesus' disciples. So he went in. It says, but Peter stood at the door without, because they didn't know him, and furthermore, he would have been wary of going to the door and trying to get in, because his face would have been known, because he was the man who chopped off the ear of Malchus. But it says, then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought her into Peter. So there was a girl at the door who knew John. John went out and said, can you allow him to come in? He's my friend. I know him. So the girl allowed him to come in. And as he was coming in, then said the damsel that kept the door lady, then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He said, I am not. Now, it's an interesting situation, because she knows that John is one of the disciples. John identifies himself straight up and says, he doesn't identify himself. She knows that he's one of the disciples, and she lets him in anyway. She's a woman. She probably has sympathy for the trauma that they are going through. So she lets in John. And then John asks about Peter, and she probably has seen them on the street somewhere, because I don't think she was in the garden to see that Peter had chopped off one man's ear. But she has seen them on the street. Everybody must have seen Jesus at some time or the other. So she says, are you not also one of this man's disciples? She says also, meaning that she knows John is one. The best thing Peter should have done is say, I am one. I have learned for myself. I've learned for myself that the best thing to do to avoid embarrassment and to avoid being deceptive is to tell people straight up who you are. I know that, for example, if I go to certain places, I'm not permitted to speak. Whenever somebody asks me, who are you? Sometimes people will ask, are you a member of this particular church? I tell them straight up, I am not. I don't want any false pretenses. I don't want to be embarrassed down the road and to be seen as a deceiver. So right away, I will say to people straight up, I am an independent Christian. I'm a Bible-believing independent Christian. I don't belong to this organization. Or if they ask me, do you believe in this particular person or this particular doctrine? I tell them straight up my position. I've learned that this is the best way. It saves you a lot of embarrassment and challenges later on. And Peter didn't learn this. Peter probably was trying to, he was still trying to use his head. All right? He had managed to escape after chopping off the man's ear. Now he doesn't want to jeopardize himself, so he comes and he says, no, I'm not one of them. This man, John, he's asking me to come in. I know him, but I'm not one of the disciples. Because he's thinking they know that one of the disciples chopped off a man's ear in the garden. I don't want them to identify him with me. So he goes and he puts himself in a place where he has no right to be. It says in verse 18, and the servants and the officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. This is one of the most terrible stories in the Bible. It's interesting because John is not standing there. John is not warming himself. I think, where is it? I think it says it. I think it says that John is not. Anyway, whether it says it or not, the fact is that it mentions that Peter goes and stands with the servants of the high priest and the soldiers. And he warms himself. In a moment when his master is on the verge of death, in a moment when his master is standing by himself in the cold, Peter goes and stands with the enemy and warms himself. Now, Peter is not as bad as Judas. He has not deliberately betrayed the Lord. But can you see how carelessness, a lack of watchfulness, a lack of dependence on the Lord can lead you to do things that are as bad as betrayal of the Lord? I mean, brothers and sisters, that is a striking lesson for us to learn. There is outright, barefaced, wicked betrayal. But there's also the denial that comes from carelessness, the denial that comes from thoughtlessness, from not keeping our hand in the hand of the Lord, from not listening to his counsel and accepting that counsel. And that was what was happening to Peter. When self is in danger, we do things without thinking, which cause great pain and harm to the one that we love best of all, to our Lord. And that is what Peter was doing. By his attitude and his behavior, he was hurting the Lord as badly as Judas had hurt him. Now, of course, Peter did not end up lost, because what he was doing was not based on rebellion against the Lord. It was based on carelessness. It was based on allowing humanity to dominate and to get the upper hand. But to Peter's credit, he did not do this consciously. It was kind of like when David took Bathsheba and murdered Uriah. As terrible as it was, the reason why God so readily forgave David is because David did this out of human blindness, not rebellion. When he was doing all of this, he did not have the honor and glory of God in his mind. Otherwise, he would not have done it. As soon as the prophet came to him and says, you are the man, David says, I have sinned. I have done this great wickedness and sinned against my God. Against thee only have I sinned. So, Peter is doing something similar, but it's not because he wants to do it. It's not because he plans to do it like Judas. It's because he is careless. And I think for all of us, it's an important lesson to learn. The Lord is suffering and you're at ease. The Lord is standing in the cold and your concern is to go and warm yourself at the fire. The Lord is hated by everybody in that room. John is not standing there, I don't think, but Peter goes and stands with the enemy because he wants to make sure nobody knows his true position. He stands with the enemy and he warms himself. This is where I'm going to stop for this evening. I don't want to go any further at the moment because I don't want to rush. There's so much to be considered as we continue to look at the rest of the chapter. So I'm stopping here for this evening, but I just want to encourage all of us to consider the points that have been made as we look at this passage. The development that is taking place in the life of Peter, the tragedy that is unfolding in the life of Peter, and even all the disciples, simply because they never took the time to understand the words of Jesus, because they never took the time to pray when he told them to pray. Sometimes it seems a small thing to neglect the counsel of the Lord, but the consequences can be devastating. Anyway, I just want to greet all of you who are here this evening. Sister Zadie, always early. And Nina is here early this evening. Greetings to you both. I am well and I am healthy, my dear sister. Thank the Lord. I have this gravel in my throat, but I mean, it's not anything serious. Sister Sharon is here too. Brother Terence, Sister Helena, big hug to you too, my dear sister. Brother Oliver from Ghana. Good to see you, my brother. Brother Wayne. Sister Anita. Sister Angela. Brother Florian, hello to you too. Sister Vesna. Good to see you. Brother Patrick. Glad you can be with us, my brother. Hope you are not in any pain this evening. Sister Ellen. There's Daniel. Sister Arthea. Blessings. Brother Flavius, hope you're okay all the way down there in Madrid. Brother Cleto, good to see you. Sister Sonia, blessings. Brother Philip, in the name of the truth. That's another new name for me. I haven't seen this before. Blessed Thursday to you also. I think that is a brother or sister. Probably brother. Good to see you. Glad to have you with us. Sister Natalie, blessings. Brother Binuil, glad you could be here also. Sister Ellen says Judas was a treasurer. Probably, yeah, he probably was some kind of accountant. He certainly was the bag keeper for Jesus and his disciples. The question that Brother Wayne asked, was Judas chosen by Christ, or was he just a close follower who merged into the group? Well, I'll tell you, in a way he had to be chosen by Christ, because it says that Jesus went and prayed all night, and in the morning he chose 12. So maybe Judas there was a band of many people that followed Christ. You know, at one time he sent out 70. So there was a large crowd that followed him, but there were 12 that he chose specially. And Judas could not have been a part of that group if Jesus had not included him. So in that sense, Jesus chose him. But you could say that Jesus also chose him to give him an opportunity to be saved, to bring him close to himself, where he could pour love upon him and try to change him from being the kind of person that he turned out to be. Brother Alexander, it's good to see you. Sister Destiny, of course, good to see you. Brother Mike from Trinidad, great to see you. Sister Chris, Sister Maria, Sister Karina. You're right, Sister Karina. Peter's denial, one of the most heart-wrenching stories in the Bible. It's a story. When I looked at it, it brought tears to my eyes when I saw how Jesus dealt with him. Good to see you, Sylvie, and Sister Kathleen. All right, Yeah, you missed most of it, but glad to have you even if it's late. And Brother Reggie, blessings. Man, I'm sorry you didn't get to make it to the camp meeting, but it's good to see you here this evening. Sister Jess, wow, it's nice to have you here this evening. You know, I meant to write to you because I had no idea the hurricane was so devastating, and then I heard that it hit Tennessee. But then Sister Natalie told me that you guys were all right, so it's really nice to see that you're able to join this evening. Thank you for the word. Thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate and love you all, and I'm grateful that we had this opportunity to meet together this evening. So I'm just going to ask you to bow your heads with me one final time as we give our Father thanks. Thank you, dear Father, for the privilege of this study this evening. Thank you for your words, so full of deep meaning, so full of strength and power for your children. I pray that you will help us, that these lessons we have learned from the lives of these disciples, from the counsel of our Lord and from the way he lived, might sink deep into our hearts and be of help to us in this task of preparing for this great and terrible time that is coming upon the world. Thank you for hearing and for answering us, our Father. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, God bless you all. I'll see you next week, and those who can, I'll see you tomorrow night for our Friday night fellowship meeting, and of course on Sabbath. So, God bless you. Take care.